Just minutes ago, inside a packed NATO press room in Norway, something happened that no one in Washington was prepared for. A single question cut through the usual diplomatic language. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it forced a moment of truth that exposed a growing fracture at the heart of the Western alliance. And when Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney answered, the room didn't react with applause. It went quiet because what he said and what he didn't say sent a message far beyond that room. A message about Donald Trump, about the future of NATO, and about who will actually control the Arctic in the years ahead. This wasn't just another press conference. This was a warning, and it may have just changed the balance of power in one of the most important regions on Earth. The setting could not have been more strategic. Northern Norway, a region that sits at the front line of Arctic security, where NATO forces are currently conducting one of their largest military exercises in recent years. Tens of thousands of troops from multiple countries operating together in freezing conditions, training for a future that no longer feels theoretical. Because the Arctic is no longer just a remote, frozen space. It is becoming the center of a new global competition, one driven by resources, trade routes, and military positioning. Standing in that environment, surrounded by European leaders and military officials, Mark Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment did the work for him because everyone in that room understood what was at stake. The Arctic is opening, ice is melting, new shipping lanes are forming. Beneath the surface, vast reserves of critical minerals and energy resources are becoming accessible, and every major power is paying attention. Russia has already expanded its military footprint across the region. China is investing billions, calling itself a near-Arctic state and positioning for long-term access. And the United States, under Donald Trump's influence, has taken a different approach, one that has raised serious concerns among allies. Talk of acquiring Greenland, open criticism of NATO, repeated pressure on allies to rethink long-standing defense commitments. These are not small signals. They are shifts that have forced countries like Canada to rethink everything. And that is exactly why Carney's presence in Norway mattered. Because Canada is not just another NATO member. It is an Arctic nation. Nearly half of its landmass lies in the north. Most of its coastline touches Arctic waters. This is not a distant issue for Canada. It is central to its national identity, its economy, and its security. For years, Canada relied heavily on its partnership with the United States to manage that responsibility. Systems like NORAD created a sense of shared defense, a belief that the Arctic would always be protected through cooperation. But that assumption is no longer as stable as it once was. And that uncertainty was sitting quietly in the background as Carney stepped up to speak. He began carefully emphasizing unity, cooperation, and shared values, the kind of language expected at a NATO event. But underneath those words, there was a different message forming, a message about independence, about preparation, about a future where Canada may have to act without waiting for Washington. And then came the moment that changed everything. A reporter asked a question that many leaders have been avoiding publicly, a question that cut directly to the core of the alliance. Can the United States still be trusted when it comes to Arctic security? It was the kind of question that usually gets a predictable answer, reassurances, diplomatic language, a quick pivot, but this time was different because the context has changed, the pressure has changed, and the stakes have changed. Carney paused, and in that pause, the room understood that whatever came next would matter far beyond that moment. Carney's answer began with a single word: yes. For a brief moment, it sounded like the expected response, a confirmation of trust, a signal that nothing had changed. But then came the pause, and in that pause, everything shifted, because what followed was not a simple reassurance. It was a carefully constructed response that revealed far more than it said on the surface. Carney pointed to NORAD, the decades-long defense partnership between Canada and the United States. He described it as deeply integrated, something that has defined North American security for generations, a system built on shared intelligence, shared responsibility, and shared trust. On the surface, it was a strong endorsement, but the emphasis was telling. Carney wasn't talking about the future, he was talking about the past, about a system that has worked for his entire lifetime, about a structure that was built under very different political conditions. And then came the pivot. Carney shifted from what has been to what is about to happen. He made it clear that Canada is no longer relying on assumptions, no longer waiting for others to take the lead. Canada, he said, is taking more control and more responsibility for the defense of its Arctic, not gradually, not symbolically, but through massive, immediate investment and a long-term strategic shift. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Canada is preparing for a future where trust alone is not enough. That is the part that made the room go quiet, because every leader standing there understood exactly what he meant. This wasn't about ending alliances. It was about reducing dependence. It was about building a system where Canada is no longer vulnerable to political changes in Washington, where a shift in U.S. leadership, a new policy direction, or even a single unpredictable decision cannot leave Canada exposed in one of the most critical regions on Earth. And that is where Donald Trump enters the picture. Over the past several years, Trump has fundamentally changed how allies view the United States, his repeated criticism of NATO, his demands that allies pay more or risk losing protection, his willingness to question long-standing commitments, and most notably, his open interest in acquiring Greenland, territory that belongs to a NATO ally. To some, those statements were political theater. But to countries in the Arctic, they were something else entirely. They were signals. Signals that the rules of the past may not apply in the future. Signals that even close allies could become strategic targets if resources and geography are at stake. For Canada, that changes the equation completely, because Canada sits next to Greenland, because it shares the same Arctic space, because it holds vast reserves of the same critical minerals that have drawn global attention. If the idea of territorial acquisition can even be discussed openly, then the level of strategic risk increases overnight. Carney didn't say that directly. He didn't need to. Instead, he talked about action. $40 billion in Arctic investment, a year-round military and surveillance presence across land, sea, and air. Infrastructure design not just for defense, but for control. Ports, airfields, communication systems, all built to ensure that Canada is not just present in the Arctic, but dominant within its own territory. And just as importantly, he talked about partnerships, not just with the United States, but with Norway, Germany, and a broader network of European allies, countries that share the same concerns, the same values, and increasingly the same understanding that the global balance of power is shifting. This is where the deeper strategy becomes clear. Canada is not replacing the United States. It is surrounding itself with options. By strengthening ties with European nations, by integrating into a wider NATO framework, and by building its own capabilities, Canada is creating a system where no single partner is indispensable. A system that can function even if one piece becomes unreliable. That is a fundamental shift in how alliances work. For decades, the United States was the center of gravity, the leader, the guarantee. But now, countries like Canada are quietly building a different model, one based on shared responsibility, distributed power, and mutual reinforcement. And that is exactly what makes this moment so significant. Because Carney didn't just answer a question about trust, he redefined what trust looks like in a world where certainty no longer exists. And as that realization settled in, it became clear that this was not just about Canada. This was about the future of NATO itself. What made this moment even more significant was not just what Carney said, but where he said it and who was standing beside him when he did. Norway is not just another NATO member. It is one of the alliance's most strategically important Arctic nations. It sits at the edge of Russian military activity in the high north. It monitors critical sea routes. It hosts advanced surveillance systems that track movements across the Arctic region. And alongside Norway stood Germany, Europe's largest economy and an increasingly central player in continental defense. This was not slew China positioning. This was alignment. Because as Carney spoke about Canada taking greater control of its Arctic future, he wasn't doing it alone. He was doing it in front of the very countries that are becoming essential to that strategy. Countries that are also adjusting their thinking. Countries that are also beginning to prepare for a world where reliance on a single superpower may no longer be enough. And that is where the idea of a new coalition begins to take shape. Not a formal alliance replacing NATO, not a direct challenge to the United States, but something more subtle and potentially more powerful. a network of countries that share intelligence, coordinate defense, invest together, and act together when necessary. A group that can operate within NATO, but also independently if circumstances demand it. Canada, Norway, Germany, the Nordic states, the Baltic countries. Individually, each of these nations plays a role, but together they form something much larger. A collective presence across the Arctic and Northern Europe that can monitor, respond, and project power across a region that is rapidly becoming one of the most contested on Earth. And that shift is not happening by accident. Russia has already treated the Arctic as a priority for years. Military bases, icebreaker fleets, missile systems. It has built an infrastructure designed to control access and assert dominance. China, while geographically distant, has approached the region with long-term strategy, investing in shipping routes, research stations, and partnerships that give it influence over future trade corridors. Against that backdrop, hesitation is not an option, and that is exactly what Carney's strategy addresses. Instead of reacting to these moves later, Canada is acting now. Instead of waiting for pressure to build, it is building its own capabilities in advance. Instead of assuming stability, it is preparing for competition. But there is another layer to this that makes it even more important. Geography. The Arctic is not isolated. It connects continents. It links North America to Europe. It creates new pathways between Asia and the West. And as ice continues to melt, those pathways become faster, more efficient, and more economically valuable. Shipping routes that once took weeks could be shortened dramatically. Resources that were once inaccessible could enter global markets. Whoever controls access to those routes and those resources will have enormous influence over global trade in the decades ahead. And that is why this is not just a military issue. It is an economic one, a strategic one, a long-term power shift that is already underway. Carney understands this, and more importantly, he is acting on it. By committing tens of billions of dollars, Canada is not just strengthening its defense. It is building a permanent presence, a signal to allies and competitors alike that the Arctic is not open for opportunistic expansion, that it is governed, monitored, protected. And by aligning with European partners, Canada is expanding the scale of that message. Because when multiple nations share the same objective, deterrence becomes stronger, response becomes faster, and influence becomes harder to challenge. This is the real significance of what happened in that press room. It was not just about one answer. It was about a coordinated shift that is already in motion. A shift away from assumptions, away from dependence, and toward a model where countries like Canada are not just participants in global security, but leaders shaping its direction. And as that shift becomes more visible, one question begins to grow louder. If this is the future that Canada and its allies are preparing for, where does that leave the United States under Donald Trump? That question is no longer theoretical. It is being asked quietly in defense ministries, openly in policy circles, and now very carefully on public stages like the one in Norway. Because the issue is not whether the United States remains powerful, it does. The issue is predictability, reliability, consistency. And under Donald Trump, those qualities have been called into question in ways that NATO allies are no longer ignoring. For decades, the foundation of the alliance was simple. The United States leads, allies align, security is shared, but ultimately guaranteed by American commitment. That model created stability. It allowed smaller and mid-sized powers to plan long-term, to invest selectively, and to assume that the core structure of the alliance would remain intact. But Trump disrupted that model. His approach to NATO was transactional. Support was tied to spending. Commitments were framed as negotiations. Long-standing alliances were treated less as strategic partnerships and more as deals that could be reconsidered at any time. For some audiences, that sounded like strength. For allies, it introduced uncertainty at the highest level. And uncertainty in security planning is not a small problem. It changes timelines. It changes investments. It forces governments to prepare for scenarios that were once considered unlikely. That is exactly what Canada is doing now. Carney's message was not about breaking away from the United States. It was about insulating Canada from risk, building a system where Canadian security does not depend entirely on decisions made in Washington, creating flexibility in a world where political shifts can happen quickly and without warning. And this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore.